Hi everyone, welcome to Navigating. Here at Navigating, we explore how people from all walks of life are finding their way through today's complex and changing world. Today I am thrilled to be joined by comedian and social activist Kristina Wong. Throughout her career, Kristina has used her writing and acting skills to focus on social themes like race and sex, privilege, and the Asian American experience. But she knows how to keep those subjects fun and funny. Hi, Kristina.
Hi, Anita. Thanks for rescuing me this Thanksgiving weekend from my family.
You're welcome.
That's really why I'm here. This is a refuge.
Yeah. How are you? How are you doing these days?
How is anyone doing? This is a time
aside from Thanksgiving.
This political moment, this moment in the world, this moment. I'm alive. I find myself doing a lot of. Like a lot of
a sigh with a little laugh after,
and kind of really having a lot of deja vu moments about the doom that I had felt about 8 years ago around this time, but assessing a lot of where I can find power and what the purpose of my work is.
Well, that's interesting because I think the deja vu is a really interesting subject to go look at a little more because we did do it 8 years ago.
Yeah. And
we lived, you and I are still here. The country went into its wobbliness with COVID as well as some other things. And then we came kind of rising out of it how we did. So does that give you hope and give you a sense that maybe we'll be able to
I crawled out of COVID, so my whole story.
Yeah, let's start with your story.
Yeah, let me start with the story. Well, I'm a solo performer and writer, and my sort of response to the 2016 election, right before 2016, I actually had a reality television pilot that was in the works with Lionsgate and True TV.
Wow, I didn't know about that.
And this is when Obama was, we sold a pilot when Obama was still in office. And had expected, in my mind, I had thought we were just headed to this beautiful place where we'd see our first woman president and all this kind of stuff. And so a lot of the kind of work I was making then was satire and playing like a very exaggerated, failed version of myself in my work. Because I felt it seemed very clear to my audience that I was making fun of myself, making fun of a persona that was clearly its own stereotype. And so basically, this show was Michael Moore meets Nathan For You, where I was Kristina, this like overly enthusiastic activist that had all these crazy plans to fix the social ills of the world with these crazy stunts that ended up being a little bit more self-obsessed than actually useful, but would be fun to watch played out. And by the time we finally got to shooting this pilot was when Trump took office and nothing made sense about the world. The self-satirizing character that was lovingly, I think, poking fun of activism and other activists was a liability to everything I cared
Wasn't
about.
Funny anymore in some ways, right?
Was kind of like clueless. Some would call it tone deaf, right? And the pilot did not get picked up to series for multiple reasons, but I was really just sort of left in this place where I was like, I don't know what my job is as an artist who used to make satire. I feel like I tried two attempts at writing plays that were like super dystopic versions of what we're living in. But I was like, why would I drag everyone to a theater to watch what's already playing out in day-to-day life?
That they can see on the news.
Yeah. Like, do I need to show you this idiocracy type world like played out on stage when we're already there? And I just woke up one day in I think 2018 and was like, I'm just going to run for office. And that felt like the aha moment as an artist of how to go about this, because it felt like artists and politicians had switched jobs. Politicians were now the spectacle makers, right? They were the ones
They were the ones in office.
They were the ones who were doing, the clowns. And as an artist, I wasn't a clown. I couldn't be really a clown anymore. It was more like I was the one like trying to push for right social change and And anyway, so that was the journey of my show, Kristina Wong for Public Office, a show that I ended up premiering in February 2020 with the idea that I ran and won a local office in Koreatown, Los Angeles, where I live.
You're a representative.
A neighborhood council representative. Neighborhood council is like, there are foot doctors. They're like, I'm like neighborhood council is like the people who collect toenails and put them in jars, right? Like it's just like not.
So you don't feel like there's a lot of influence.
There's not a lot of influence. You don't get paid. Every city, I guess, has a different kind of neighborhood council system. Yeah. We have 99 neighborhood councils in LA. I find it I will tell you after the fact, I find it a very dysfunctional system that was well intended in theory for people to feel like they had a voice in City Hall, but it ends up being a bunch of volunteers like bumping against bureaucracy and making suggestions which often just get completely ignored by the city council people who can vote on it. So I ran and won, and one of the big things that we did accomplish was a symbolic gesture. We voted to abolish ICE. And as it turns out, neighborhood council cannot take down a federal agency. I live in a neighborhood that is mostly immigrant. A lot of it powered by a lot of the labor that comes out of my neighborhood is powered by undocumented immigration. And it was a very emotional vote. We had all these people who were undocumented come speak. I cried. A lot of people cried.
I bet everybody cried. That's a really emotional issue.
Yes. And as it turns out, we can't take down a federal agency, right?
But the symbolic gesture means something, I think also. I mean, because you want to have that kind of I was thinking when you first were talking about being on the city council or the neighborhood council is, think globally, act locally is what the theory would be. It's like, what would be best for this whole nation? Let's get rid of ICE.
Yeah.
Can we do it in this neighborhood? So as a result, let me just ask this, a political question then. Since the vote went through, do you find there's a lot less ICE intervention in the neighborhood?
Our vote did not. I think it was filed on a website that people could look at. LA did, I believe, declare themselves a sanctuary city, which means they will not devote, if I believe I'm quoting this right, will not use city resources like police to cooperate with federal agencies to help assist. So it just makes it a little trickier for these sort of sweeps to happen. But it was like, for me, an incredible moment of community morale and the kinds of things we were voting on were like logo design contests and do we want this liquor store or this bar to have a liquor license, and like this was just a really meaningful moment for us to just kind of remember who we are, and who we want to care about in this neighborhood. And that to me is what art is. It's like just a series of symbolic gestures. And I also think that's what government is a lot of symbolic gestures. You see like local governments voting for a ceasefire, things like that. Does Netanyahu look at what Portland City Council has voted on? No. But,
But in Portland, they know that they voted and they know that they heard each other's voices.
They heard each other and it makes an imprint on the news. It's culture. It's culture shifting. And so that to me is sort of the similarity of what government and politics does. Government is much more legislation that has rules that define our lives and our bodies and what we have access to. Art is a little bit different. So this all goes to the first question: how am I doing?
That was a good answer. I think there's probably a lot of viewers who don't know a lot about your history.
Sure.
So why don't we start at the beginning and what drew you to performance? And I've seen one of your shows in person and I loved it, but I'm not going to talk about that yet because that's such a good show and that comes through the pandemic. So
yeah. Well, I'm a San Francisco native and I grew up in the city. I went to Mercy High School. Interestingly enough, if you go to Wikipedia's page for Mercy High School, I am listed as a notable alum with Kimberly Guilfoyle. Yes.
Your BFF.
She's older than me, but the school's now closed for lack of enrollment. So we were the best they could do, and now we're closed. But third generation.
Polar opposite.
Yeah, polar opposite. Third generation Chinese American.
They represent both sides.
It was interesting because after her, the best is yet to come? Like after that RNC.
You have to don't you have to have your arms up when you say
the best is yet to come? I'm Facebook friends with the high school speech coach, and I was teasing her, like, did you teach her to do that? I did not teach her to do that.
I would never ask her. That's so over the top.
But anyway, so yeah, I went to UCLA. I would say that I very much the ethos that I grew up under was to be highly successful and highly accomplished without rocking the boat. And so that meant understanding that there were odds against me, that people would read me in a specific way, and the way to find success is just be a really good doctor or be a really good engineer or a really good business person, but don't, like, definitely not what I do now for a living. I didn't know existed, and I was certainly not encouraged to do that. But I think all the repression from those teenage years pushed me to, like, you know what I'm going to do for a living with my UCLA degrees? I'm going to be a solo performer on stages. So what I like to tell people is sort of my outlet early on before I discovered high school theater was prank calling. Like, go over to a friend's house and we'd have people's phone numbers and we'd pretend to be different people. And that, what I enjoyed about that was the sort of thrill of changing the outcome of real life through the craft of imitation or pretending to be somebody else. And then and it was also like a moment to be separated from my body, right? To just be on the phone and pretending, hi, it's me, Brock. I have a big crush on you. Yeah. Just ridiculous dumb calls.
You do.
But yeah, and I mean, basically, I feel like I'm sort of that same person who like to disrupt people's lives, but more towards political good, not making someone think that some guy had a crush on her, right? I guess it wasn't until I think I was always had a bug in me that knew something was wrong. And it wasn't until I got to college that I had a language and, began to study history more critically and social dynamics and race dynamics and gender dynamics and understand, oh my God, like there's sexism, there's racism. I've experienced it.
So you must have experienced racism growing up.
Oh, completely. And it plays out differently.
Mercy High is a Catholic school, right?
It is, yes.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think there's that racism. Do we have this much time? I mean, just sort of the subtle ways in which people assume that you might have power or open the door for you to exercise power or offer you privilege or, it was sort of assumed that I think because I was in this kind of Asian female body, I think sort of what I felt like I was dealing with as a young student was, being fairly invisible. Like that was just sort of the way I was read and it was sort of assumed I was invisible. And so I kind of got into a little bit of trouble in ways that I think I would have gotten into more trouble maybe if I was of another race. I would have been more visible or more targeted as that, but I'm sort of able to kind of use this as a disguise.
Yeah, you often talk about Asian American stereotypes. And so by being an Asian American young woman, there may have been the perception of, oh, she wouldn't have done that. Or that kind of, is that what you're talking about? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or she's not like that.
She's not like that. She's a good girl.
She's a good girl.
Yeah.
Or we assume that she probably is of this, does this for a living and has these aspirations and wouldn't do whatever. And sometimes it would be a weird thing that kind of kept me out of trouble because no one would suspect me, right?
Yeah.
Where can I go with this?
Well, you started writing plays at that
I started
point.
writing plays, yeah. So I guess I would say the earliest plays were these little prank calls or these moments. And then when I got to college and saw just how much there's just, I guess, so much that I sort of repressed and was taught not to kind of speak up about and don't protest about. And then there's a huge culture of activism at UCLA and that I was introduced to. And a lot of it was not healthy for me to be screaming and yelling in the street. Like, yes, we get I get why that needs to happen, but if that is the only outlet, it's exhausting. If you're just screaming no, 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 no to a machine.
And is it effective? That's always the question. As a anti-war protester myself, was it effective, or did it just make me feel like at least I was out in the street screaming?
Yeah, because this whole situation is a marathon, right? And this fight to end oppression, curb oppression, create healthier communities. This is a lifelong journey. And so I discovered a world of artists of color, solo artists who are making their own work, making work that did not require, and I mean theater work or creative work that didn't require an audition, right? That was very novel for me because the way I had learned theater had worked is someone writes a script, you audition, someone else chooses you, you rehearse a line someone else wrote, and therefore you get to be a performer. But it was like so profound, like what? You could write your own piece and nobody could tell you can't do it. And so that felt more interesting to me because it felt more like a different way to take up space that wasn't screaming no, 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 no. It felt like let me tell you how I survive, where I survive. And then that space itself in the theater became its own community in that moment, right? Of people like being empathetic and listening. And I found it more effective than the free therapy sessions that they were offering at UCLA. Like it was like the one thing I looked forward to was my creative writing class with Greg Saris, or the Invisible World class with Peter Sellers was making weird art. And so I had this crazy nutty idea from looking at the folks who visit our campuses. I'd be just like them and I would do this for a living. And here I am over 20 years later.
Doing this for a living, writing your own material, getting your messages out as you want to, not memorizing someone else's lines.
Yeah.
So I didn't see any of your work until I saw the Sweatshop Overlord, but I do know about Wong Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I just want to talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, so Wong Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a show. I premiered that in 2006. I toured it on and off for 8 years.
It was a long time, yeah.
I tend to like start a show not knowing how, I sort of almost half pick the topic because it's interesting to me, and then I find personal ways to enter the material. And I had stumbled across a statistic in 2004 that Asian American women had the second highest rates of depression and suicide. And it was
after who? Who's the first?
I think it was young Asian American women, and I think that's what's unclear.
Who's number one?
Number one, I think, is older. It might be older Asian women, or I'm not sure.
Okay.
You think I would know this.
That's a good statistic to know about, though, because I hadn't heard that before.
And maybe it's shifted in the last 15 years since it's come out.
Yeah.
I've toured that show so long. I did go to one campus where they said, well, some of these studies, like these surveys are not necessarily comprehensive. And there's all these, if you look for the information enough in a study, you'll find it. So it's not that it's been debunked, but I've heard challenges to this.
But it affected you to hear that.
Yeah, it was both very familiar and but also surprising. Like we were all hiding the secret that's out in public, right? And around that time, the journalist Iris Chang, she had written books like The Rape of Nanking. I don't want to name all the titles because I might get them wrong, but she was a journalist and she wrote about some really heavy, violent stuff in history. And I remember her coming to my campus at UCLA, late 90s, and saying that she was approached to write a book about the Korean comfort women, like basically women who were taken in by the Korean women who were taken in by the Japanese Imperial Army and were taken in as sex slaves. And she said she had to say no because she needed to guard herself emotionally. And I never heard that phrase before, protect myself emotionally. I was just like, what? But you're successful. Like in my mind, the way I was raised, like, you just push through it. If someone offers you a book, you take the book, right? Like I never heard this idea that there are limits to our mental health and you say no. Yeah. When even if it means a potential successful book or working and making money. And then she commits suicide a few years later.
See, it's such an incredibly powerful lesson to actually learn for ourselves that maybe we should turn off the news. Maybe we shouldn't watch that movie. Maybe we shouldn't read that book or write that story or whatever it is, because our mental health is pretty fragile, especially with things that are happening all over the world right now. We don't want to push ourselves too hard. And so what did you do after that with that concept?
With that information, I was trying to think about, see, it's a combination of knowing that I'm trying to make a living doing what I want to do as an artist, thinking about what would be useful for people to watch that they would want to remunerate me for my talents. And I blurted out loud, my new show will be about depression and suicide among Asian American women.
Did you blurt it? You did?
I kind of did. Yeah. I was at the Wellesley campus.
And by that time it was out and you said it.
It was like 2005. Yeah. I blurted, I said it to my friend as I was walking around. I was visiting her campus and said that. And just sort of, I didn't say, I'm going to work on a show about my issues with this topic. I had thought I was just going to research other people outside the Wong family and, and that this would just be this like highly researched theoretical show. But as it turns out,
it keeps coming home, doesn't it?
Most of my shows never work that way. Like I always go topic first. I'm going to run for office. I'm going to do a show about the environment. And then, the only way a show really kind of gets interesting is if you get into the why. Otherwise, we would all just read research papers about this, right? So, so the show becomes over 2 painful years of development and a year on the road of still trying to make it.
This is Wong Flew Over the
Cuckoo's Nest. Is a show about a character named Kristina Wong who sets out to fix this issue with a show, this issue of depression. And, it's not about me. No, it's about other people outside the Wong family. And that deep denial, which is really how this issue very much exists, I think, in Asian communities, is that, you don't see a therapist. You don't tell strangers your stories. You don't, you don't entrust someone with that baggage. They're probably tied to the government. And then if they find out, they'll kick you out of the country. Like these are real things.
Those are real worries and real concerns
that exist, right? Around this stuff. And so instead it's better to be profitable and unhappy. It's better to be, to look the part of being fine than actually be happy, right? So these are all sort of things I had to contend with when making this show. And it was both healing by the time I finally got it in good shape. It was a year on the road of touring this where it finally felt like a performance and not like an exorcism of my personal pain.
So let me ask about that. So as you performed in that first year, was it in fact exorcising your personal pain? And that was why after a year, you had hammered it into a place where it was
funny. It became more funny.
Yeah, you had let enough out that it could be funny.
Yes.
And it didn't feel as tragic.
Yeah. It's the whole tragedy plus time equals comedy thing. It was at first it was just so. I'm trying to tell these stories, but it still hurts, right? These stories still hurt. Yeah. And then I figured out if I really lean in to the premise of the show being like the show, everyone, it's fiction. Everyone say it with me. Fiction. Yeah, it's all fiction. And so it's the world's longest preface at the top of the show where I set it up like it's all fiction. Everything's fiction. In fact, we're going to draw the dramatic arc of fiction. And, here's the crisis, rising action, resolution. And basically throughout the show, I never get past the crisis. I keep turning on my overhead projector and trying to check in where we are with the dramatic arc of fiction. We're still at the crisis. So it becomes sort of a metaphor for the fiction that this issue is in our communities. Right. And the more we fictionalize that this might be real, the more it really comes back to hurt us. And I've heard so many crazy. I have to be aware of when I use the word crazy because I know there's a lot of issues around using that. But the sort of wild, unthoughtful things that I hear when I tell people I've worked on the show, straight up people will say, Asian American women have high rates of depression. They seem fine to me. They look fine
and seem
to me. I'm like, okay, I'm glad that's the gauge of it. But I also have that kind of thing too, where I look at other Asian women. And I go, wow, everyone's so normal and happy and has their 2.2 kids. And
what's wrong with me?
And what's wrong with
Oh my God. I think women in general, though, I have to say, I think across the board in many ethnicities, women compare themselves all the time to each other. And that's the societal pressure. I mean, I just know that I have friends who are like, oh my God, she still colors her hair. And other friends are like, oh, why did she let it go gray? I mean, there's just so much
You
pressure.
can't win.
You
There's also
can't.
you
You
can't
just
win,
can't
right?
win with other women, and I think we're working on it. This whole idea, and especially
hope
with the
so.
political pressure that we feel from outside ourselves, that we're starting to really work on. Let me give you a hand up. Let me help you. Let me have your back no matter what, and let me believe in you. And
Yeah.
that's a really big women's issue right now, I think. And
Yeah. And so much of what was kind of stunning about doing that show was I had a few women in crisis show up at shows.
Yeah.
And Q&As are people just start crying and ask me questions as if I was actually trained in social work
Or the therapist that they really needed all along, right?
and that's
Yeah.
when things got really hard because I
Yeah.
was not equipped to and it's not that I don't want to be better at supporting those folks, but that is not my long-term vision to become a social worker or therapist. I am just the customer, everybody, right? I'm still figuring it out too. I'll listen to you.
Yeah.
And try to be as supportive as I can, but I definitely am trying to figure this out myself, and
that's what the story is trying to figure it out.
But what was hard was in order to book this. I was like one of the first shows that really toured. I felt like I had a lot of. It's also hard when you make a show when you're about 28 years old and tour it for 8 years. Your life changes so much, and you're playing this older version of yourself.
Yeah.
And I guess it's different if you're playing a fictitious character on Broadway. That's not you at all. But there's a moment where it was both very healing for me to try to describe mental health in the metaphor that I had put together on stage. And then there was a moment where I was over it and just doing it over and over again because it was my livelihood. Showing up at campuses where students had, taken their lives, right? And almost like brought in as a response to like these really tragic things that had happened on these campuses. And I was just sort of like, this is a lot to do this over and over again.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the shows I've made since have been a response to learning, okay, we're not going to make a show mining the worst of your pain. I'm not going to make a show and tour it for 8 years, even if it's doing very well. And by well, I guess people still want to see it.
Yeah.
And so, I could talk more about that, but like basically now when I look at new shows, I try to learn something new, and I know that I will cycle out of it in 2 or 3 years.
Well, since we're talking about navigating, I was astonished when I finally figured out what you did in the pandemic.
Yeah.
that was mind blowing to me. So let's talk about Sweatshop Overlord, where you were on stage, you were performing. You heard the pandemic was coming. The lights went out.
Pandemic was here. Yeah.
Yeah. The pandemic was here. The lights went out. You went home and tried to figure out what to do.
Yeah. So that was me. So when the pandemic hit, I had done my second live show of Kristina Wong for public office with the idea that I was going to keep touring it till the 2020 November election live. And I was barely making a live. As it turns out, when you make a show about running for office, very few people want to fund it because they're very confused about whether or not it's legal for them to.
Yeah.
Like, are we paying for your campaign? What's happening here? But after I had premiered it, I think the interest began to grow. There, people were like, okay, we get what this is, and then but there was no theater suddenly, and I sew my set pieces. And I'm feeling bad for myself, but I can't feel bad because everybody is in this situation suddenly where the livelihoods we had are unessential. And I saw that a hospital was looking for home sewn masks, and I went, oh my God, I have one essential skill that could help an essential worker. And so I had some scraps of fabric and elastic on my sewing table, and I made a mask using directions. I think this was March 20th, maybe I sewed my first mask.
That's early on.
2020, yeah. And I made a very naive offer to the internet that if you need a mask or immunocompromised, which is everybody at this point, I'll help you. And I'm suddenly playing God. I'm getting these crazy requests from firefighters, nurses, and I have to decide. It's not like I'm just sitting on hundreds of masks. It takes quite a long time. We are a world Amazon primed to believe we can just click a few buttons and stuff shows up at our door.
Right.
And we are not in that moment. Like, masks were not part of our culture. So I started a group called the Auntie Sewing Squad 4 days later to like help with the overload of requests. And
who was in the Auntie Sewing Squad?
My mother was in it, her friends, anyone I knew with a sewing machine. It was a lot of Asian women who were in the group, and the whole joke was like, oh my God, this is like a modern day, this is like, we're like a weird college educated sweatshop. Like, this is not, my grandparents who worked in the laundries did this work, I'm guessing so that I wouldn't have to do this work again. And now I find myself, doing this manual labor, directing other people to do it for free because the government has failed to prepare us for this, this moment.
It's needed.
And it's like, at one point I actually did try to hire factory workers, but because they were all working remotely, and basically I called the Garment Workers Center, which is not a hiring agency, but they do advocacy for garment workers. They were like, we're trying to just get a charter of work standards from working at home for our workers. So, it's like all these kind of systems in place were taking so long that the fastest thing you could do was tear your bed sheets, cut your bra straps, and start making these masks. So I thought this was just going to be a 2-week stopgap until this was somehow all over and abated. We ended up going on for 500 days. We ended up doing relief van trips to the Navajo Nation. We helped some organizers at Standing Rock by an ambulance. We were doing winter coat drives to the Lakota tribe, to Navajo Nation. We were sending stuff to the border for folks who were seeking asylum. Like, it became such an operation. 800 aunties, 350,000 masks.
800.
Yeah.
Oh, my estimate was so much lower. So 800
They weren't all active sewing at the same time.
350,000
masks. That's according to what we added from our spreadsheets. It could have been more or less. And then it was a lot of medical supplies that we had relocated. We just sort of rehomed to different places that needed it.
Well, I guess once the agencies or somebody found that you were effective, they started asking you to do some other things as well.
Yes, that's a scene that was from real life. Is a social worker in Alameda County actually asked us to make masks for a backpack drive. And I was like, wait, we've been waiting for you to help us.
Yeah.
And now you need us to help you.
Yeah.
And I could tell she herself was it almost felt like she was a rogue employee trying to make this backpack drive for kids happen. And she's like, oh, our agency is forced to ask the sheriff for money for this and that. And and this is around the same week that they were sending rocket ships into space. Right? Like,
why not? Why not spend money that way?
When Jeff Bezos and his brother were like flying to space, and like, I'm just like, this is so backwards, right? Like, and this was like it was like a year, from the start we're getting asked to do these things. So, just so much was revealed, so much of the humor of Kristina Wong Sweatshop Overlord, which ends up being this unintentional show. I call it the accidental pregnancy show. Like, who knew we would be in this situation, and who knew I'd find myself running a sewing group, then making a show about it, which would then premiere off Broadway, would then become the finalist for the Pulitzer. And then,
it was so moving. I have to say,
thank you.
I have to say that it was, it was comedic, but at the same time, I just felt like, I teared up several times watching it, because all of us felt so isolated during that time.
Yeah.
And it was so weird to try to figure out what to do. And you pulled together literally an army of women who could sew,
the show
who
uses
apparently
a lot
could
of
drive
army.
And could give, give things,
It was a lot of army metaphors in the show. I felt like an army general, and instead of guns, we had sewing machines. Instead of bullets, we had fabric.
Yeah.
And we had participation and people, because I think we all felt like this kind of work is the difference between life or death right now.
Right.
And we could sit here and get mad that our theater show was canceled, or we could try to do something to move through this moment.
Yeah.
And I had never experienced generosity like that before. I still don't know what half those aunties do for a living. I still don't know if they could help me with my career, right? But I know that I love them so much because in a time that was very scary, they were willing to leave their house to go pick up some elastic.
Right.
They were willing to like pass out on a sewing machine. Not that I told them
after
to do
sewing
that.
for 18 hours. Yeah.
I didn't tell them to do that. The joke was I would tell them to do that. But you know, like some of these aunties would fall asleep at sewing machines, and because it's hard. If you know that one more hour of you at a sewing machine could get these masks to, you know, whatever group of folks who wouldn't have access to it otherwise, you would stay up and do that.
Yeah.
And so that kind of and then we also took care of each other because it became very clear folks are going to burn out.
Yeah.
And so those who could not sew baked, made meals, dropped off care packages, and got those to the aunties who were working super hard just to make sure, because it was hard to take a break.
Because this pandemic kept going and you kept getting the requests.
Yeah,
It wasn't like
those
it wasn't
first
like
few weeks
anything
were
stopped.
awful.
Yeah.
We're 8 days a week of, you imagine and like we don't want to set up like an Airtable or some sort of Google form where you could just sign up for a mask, because then it would go totally out of control. We
Right.
wanted to have a connection to the people asking for it, just
Right.
because a lot of people were panicking openly to us and just going, just send as many as you can. I'm like, give me a number, 10. Like, so some people's as much as you can is 10 masks, and for some people it was 250,000, right? So it was just like trying to
Good to
figure
ask.
out
Yeah.
how to not just make things that get thrown into a black hole, but if you're going to work this hard on a mask, to have a sense of, is someone actually distributing it? Because we're not just going to send random masks to mailboxes that nobody's checking
Right.
in a pandemic. So there was all the, you know, so there's a whole system in place. It was not just people sewing. But you know, just and people's needs would change day to day.
Right.
Like maybe they would get a shipment of masks from some local government agency and they didn't need our mask anymore. So we just needed to stay in touch with everybody to kind of get a sense of like, wow, we can't give you 250. I'm talking about farm workers. Farm workers. They were like, we have a network of 250,000 farm workers.
Because they move and
they move. Yeah. It was like,
mobile.
well, how can we hold you over for now? Yes.
Right.
We understand there are 300 million people in this country, but okay.
What-
You have to quickly change priorities and go, what's the most vulnerable?
Yes.
Like who can cover, like some people aren't going to leave their house. They're not a priority then to send masks to.
So it's like triage at
It's
that
triage.
point.
Yeah. And it was so bizarre because it was like, I'm the same person that just a few years before was doing stand-up dressed like a giant fabric vagina. And now I'm using those same skills to possibly save a whole nursing unit, right? This is so nuts.
Well, you know, it brings up the question, though, that you created such an enormous community of people. You talk about generosity and the sharing and the community and the communication. So moving forward to where we are now and where we feel like, boy, we need to figure out what we're going to do next. It's possible. I guess what I'm saying is, what I'm seeing is possibility of creating really extended community. You and I talked a little bit in our texting about mutual aid, which is the direction that I've been moving in of, okay, who needs what right now? And, you know, because the election results have made me feel like if there's really going to be mass deportations, maybe I'm going to talk with the local Canal Alliance, it's called here, where immigrants come in. Maybe I can help them. Do they need a toothbrush? Do they need socks? Do they need
what do they need?
Yeah, so this might be the skill set that you've now developed that is going to help move into the future, which...
Yeah, no, I did not know what mutual aid was until knee deep in Auntie Sewing Squad and other aunties were like, this is mutual aid. I actually had to go look up a video. I picked the one that had a cartoon with it because I was like, that one I'll understand. And the way I understand it is sort of charity meets anarchy. It's taking away the bureaucracy.
I haven't thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's instead of the bureaucracy of like, oh, we have to file our nonprofit status and build a board of directors.
Yeah.
And there was someone else in the mask making world who was trying to get who went through the trouble of in the pandemic starting a nonprofit. And she would constantly message me because she had no money as a nonprofit. Like, I think there's this thinking that you start a nonprofit, all this money just shows up.
No, that's where
That's
I
a
had a
complete
nonprofit. That's the
no.
rules and regulations for nonprofit are enough to stop anybody. No, it's almost truly, if you want to get something done, you start doing it.
You just start doing
You just
it. Yeah.
start doing
Like, don't
it.
skip the paperwork and
Yeah.
the filing.
Yeah.
And especially because you want it to go away.
Right.
And all nonprofits, in my opinion, maybe with the exception of theater nonprofits, because we want to keep seeing theater and art being made, but like nonprofits for homelessness or poverty
Right.
or, you know, they should all get to a point where they've fixed their problem and they're out of business, where they've made themselves obsolete.
Right.
And Auntie Sewing Squad, our unintentional acronym was ASS, by the way, but ASS's goal was to be obsolete. And there was pressure, like aunties were like, we should just form a nonprofit. You could get grants that way. I'm like, I don't want to be sewing emergency masks out of bed sheets forever. And I don't want to be absorbing all the money raised for a salary or overhead. And then it would really confuse who gets paid what if suddenly some people get paid and then all these other people are not. You know, it almost makes sense that we just sort of do what we can in this moment, and we can be flexible to respond to situations versus like, well, bring that up at our staff meeting and figure out. Yeah. I mean, this is why these government agencies were asking us for masks, because they were all mired in their own bureaucracy.
They couldn't get anything because of how long it would have taken for them to get something. Yeah. So, well, and as we're facing the way artists and comedians now are going to be moving forward. I mean, I guess I have a question about cancel culture too for you and how
the good old days.
Yeah, the good old days, and where I mean, do you feel that cancel culture or the criticism of people for what they have said and done publicly has that affected humor? Has that affected comedy? Has it affected you in the way that you can present yourself?
I remember the moment in around 2013 where there was someone named Sui Park, who was a Twitter hashtagivist, who has since disappeared from the internet. And her whole thing was calling other activists out, calling everybody out on the internet, to the point that she started to trend cancel Colbert for an out of context tweet that from a joke that Colbert had made. And that to me was like, I was like, oh, I get it. This is what Twitter's for, to yell at people and be completely unforgiving and put them in the shame corner. And I am guilty of putting people in the shame corner, and I've had people put me in that shame corner. And now I'm like, well, now we've just split the left so much that nobody, I'm seeing people who are canceled come back and they have specials and they seem to still be working. And
are they different though? Do you think their humor's different at this point?
I think there's a sort of this. Well, I could speak broadly because there's no monolith around it, but when so many people are canceled, they all have to come back. It's they're still alive. They have lives to lead. And so they resurface, they rework their lives as reality TV stars, like the reality television villain. Who knew that this was going to be a thing that would warrant having its own show, its own genre? But sometimes, like, that cancelable culture is rewarded. And as we saw from election results, not everyone is on the same side. There's a guy with 34, felony convictions who gets to be like he didn't get canceled. So anyway, I also think that our social media channels are so split, so Tower of Babel right now, that there's not like one consistent place to be canceled for enough people to know. Like, you really have to have made national news. But I think for like some comedians, maybe people bicker or have issues with you, and it used to be like those kind of things would last a day, and now they last for like 3 minutes, and then everyone moves on to the next thing. Right. So, but
it ties in some ways with what you're saying about maybe now it's time to be sensitive with your humor.
Yeah. I mean, that was a revelation I had during the first Trump presidency, was maybe the most innovative thing I can do as a comedian is be earnest instead of trying to joke about everything. I mean, I was cracking a lot of tweets at bad politicians and stuff like that. But it felt like one of the rare in social media space is so fast and so quick jabs and stuff, and there's no nuance. And for me, what I love about the technology of theater, we keep trying to make more technology to make more elevated art, but I feel like old school theater, when you're looking an actor in the eye and there's no special effects and no editing, and they're just telling you how they failed, and how they overcame that. To me, that is this incredible technology of empathy, theater. So there's something about, this earnestness and not, and just sort of holding the space. And that was something I noticed in the pandemic when all these late night comedians were broadcasting from their house, and there was no laughter.
Yeah.
And that, or it was maybe one of their spouse. It's usually a wife, because most of the late night guys were men. But their spouse was or their wife was the only audience member. In the room laughing, and there was something sort of very human about that.
Human and vulnerable is what I was thinking.
Human and vulnerable. Dave Chappelle, as many criticisms as I have about his stand-up specials, he did this piece, I think it was called 316. It was the amount of time that George Floyd was had a knee on his neck, and he wasn't cracking jokes. He was just talking about this moment, and it just sort of felt like maybe this is where we're at. Is that I had believed long before this that there was a bar where everyone understood this is ridiculous. This is over the top. This is something we all understand is bad, and this is good. And I'm gonna disrupt this by satirizing myself as a character in this. And as it turns out, we aren't even at the place where people can see me past this persona of what I read as to them as an Asian woman, that they can't even imagine that I could possibly satirize that as well. So, So
you're writing something now, though,
so,
right?
And it's been tricky because it's using, to me, there is a lot of satire. It's called, my new show is Kristina Wong, Food Bank Influencer. And in the pandemic, one of the parts of our mutual aid ecosystem was this place called World Harvest Food Bank in LA, a very disruptive model of a food bank. It's not part of the Feeding America network. That's how not like a regular food bank it is.
Not bureaucratic, like what we were just saying.
I mean, he has to deal with bureaucracy. The owner, Glenn, does, and he is a nonprofit. But he doesn't take certain funding because he just wants people to be able to come in. It looks like a store, and anybody can get groceries for either a $50 donation, 4 hours of volunteer work, or maybe you can get a voucher from a city council person. And it is so fun to be in there, and in a world where food banks feel like very limited, and you have this very rationed amount of food you can't choose. Suddenly, you're in this environment where you can kind of choose what you put in your cart. You put too much in, and you're invited to put way too much in.
Oh, you are. It sounds really different.
Overflowing cart, because otherwise, a lot of it is perishable and would go bad anyway. So, as it turns out, there's just too much of that stuff. And I became its unofficial influencer. And it really sort of has shifted my relationship with food, with generosity, with giving, with realizing, hey, everything's here, folks. It's just here at this particular food bank. And now we just have to help distribute this out. But it got me into looking at sort of the politics of the nonprofit food bank and emergency system. We had more food banks during Reagan's presidency than any other and it's not because, here's a good thing we should have. It's because hunger went up.
Yes, really fast.
And the slashes to the federal safety net were happening during his presidency. And so that has been sort of the arc of this show I'm creating is, I love food banks. I love emergency food. And then realizing, oh my God, this is a Band-Aid for a big mess of a system that is basically snake eating the tail. And so it's been a little tricky because I have critics already who see the name of the show and they go, how dare she make fun of hungry people? How dare she? Food banks are universally good. You can't.
That's the hard thing.
You?
Yeah, I know. And that's the hard thing with nonprofits in general is that they feel threatened. They are threatened by mutual aid because mutual aid is so disorganized but gets things done really fast.
Yeah.
But didn't you need to get a grant? No, I just cooked this soup and I took it over there.
We took it over.
Yeah, so it's
took it in a wagon and walked it over to some people who live in a tent in the corner. Yeah, no, it's like and there's a lot of I don't know how to talk about this yet, but I've had some run-ins with the higher ups of the food bank world, and which very much comes with them going, you're mocking the poor, which I'm like, I'm mocking my own stories of poverty. Like, I don't know what you want here, but there's a lot of sacred cow stuff that people are quick to jump to when they find out you're a comedian working with social issues. I had people commenting in the comments of New York, just one or two people, like, were just horrified by Sweatshop Overlord as a title for the show. They're like, how could you make fun of sweatshop workers? And And I'm like, you really think this went all the way to New York Theater Workshop, got a critic's pick from New York Times, because I'm sitting here making fun of sweatshop workers? Come on, people. Like, look past titles.
See, that's a hard thing. Yeah, it's a hard thing. I think when people become so sensitive that they want to make certain that they don't offend anybody. And that kind of gets back to, the cancel culture. Like, how funny can I be?
Yeah.
I think that's really funny. Oh, but that person over there is not going to think that's very funny. You walk this fine line, but at the same time, I think you have to represent yourself and you have to represent what it is your message really is. And, do everything you can to set these other people straight, that if it feels politically incorrect to them, it's really not. It's you making fun of, the stories or what you've already experienced.
To me, like, the misunderstanding that I feel, I wish people would just sit with nuance a little longer, but the misunderstanding, and sometimes stuff backfires, but like, the activists like myself who do use humor and comedy to address social issues, we're not doing it please give us enough credit to think we're not doing it at the expense of those people who are suffering the most. Right. Like, I'm always thinking in a situation, and I teach this too when I teach humor and political humor writing, is what is it? Who are your good guys, your bad guys, and your gray guys? And sometimes, like, so gray guys are the people you come at the comedy with maybe a little bit more of a surgical knife, rather a big machete. So for some people, it's their own relatives are both good guys and bad guys. The good guys because they're my relatives. They're bad guys because the things they vote for and believe for are completely counter to the things that I value and care about, right? And so you don't want to be going at your family like, like, screw you, mom. Like, but what are those kind of playful, more delicate ways we can, get to that humor? And for me, with Sweatshop Overlord, it wasn't making fun of the 1 million Americans who, perished because of COVID. It was just how absurd the situation was that we are the most developed country, this rich, developed, powerful country, where people are suddenly so, that we've outsourced everything. We're so efficient. Now we have to sew our own masks because
the irony is just.
So these are the things that I think are worth finding the humor and how we go about finding that humor.
And it sounds like this is how you can move forward in this new administration, this new next 4 years coming up, and with the communities I know.
It was Prozac and marijuana, and I quit that. I'm doing this sober, everybody.
Now it's just you. Now you just have to breathe and eat good food.
It's really hard.
And keep laughing. And this is where we are. And that's the whole point of pivoting, navigating. It feels like sometimes, to me, it feels like moment by moment, we're looking for what door is opening, what window is opening, where can I get in? oh, this door is totally closed. I better stop knocking on it. I make the joke of knocking on doors that feel like it's a speakeasy and I don't have I really don't have the password. But meanwhile, over here, it's wide open. Go for where it's wide open.
Or you stay if you can't open that door, you stay where you are and you build the world you want right there.
Right in front of it. Yeah, yeah.
So there's going to be a lot of isolating.
Yeah.
I know that's happening. I heard that people watching the news has gone down.
Way down.
I'm one of those folks.
Yeah, me too.
I just be such a news junkie.
Yeah.
And I can't.
Yeah.
I find myself unwinding watching scam videos and true crime. You know something's wrong when I'm like, let me relax by watching like this mass murderer special, right? Like,
as long as they're caught, if they catch them. No, we're always looking for metaphors, aren't we?
Oh God.
Winning, yeah. But that's, I mean, you have so many skills. You have so much experience. You've already built huge communities of people who know how to give, and you are so good at getting people to laugh at the things that make them cry also. So I'm completely thrilled that you came and joined me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was a really good conversation, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what that food bank play is going to be like.
Yeah,
and
me too.
You tour.
If I get canceled, 5 people will probably know, and then I'll just keep doing it.
Do it anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kristina.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.